The language of the Hebrew man, loud and clear. The language of the Hebrew man. It is the language of the prophets, of the sign up on the wall. It is old and sacred. It will open up your soul. Speak up. The language of the Hebrew man. Loud and clear, the language of the Hebrew man. From the deepest mess of downtown Babylon, it will take you to the next land, to Mount Zion. It will get you up, it will make you fly. The language of the Hebrew man will take you high. Abraham spoke the language of the Hebrew man, and also Jesus from Nazareth, and Maria Magdalene, Einstein, Jeremiah, the Dylan, and the Cohen. They know something about the language of the Hebrew man. And when the Lord said, let there be light, it was in the language of the Hebrew man. And when Moses said, let my people go, it was in the language of the Hebrew man. Speak the language of the Hebrew man. Speak the language of the Hebrew man. Oh yeah. Speak the language of the Hebrew man.
ברוכים הבאים. ברוכים הבאים. On behalf of Ivrit B'Merkaz, Hebrew at the Center, I want to welcome you to Sicha, a series of online conversations focused on Hebrew, Ivrit. My name is Arnie Winchell, and I am founding president of Ivrit B'Merkaz. Ivrit B'Merkaz was founded over 10 years ago with the mission to revolutionize the teaching and learning of Hebrew. We chose this focus in service of a vision of a world where Hebrew literacy is vibrant, celebrated, and pivotal to a thriving Jewish identity and global Jewish community. When we set out as a small group of Hebrew language educators and enthusiasts to disrupt the status quo, we envisioned our contribution to this Salon, this dream, would come through addressing what has been a lack of success in effectively giving the gift of proficiency in Hebrew to Jews throughout the diaspora. We believe that through a deep investment in our educators and educational system to ensure effective and engaging Hebrew teaching and learning, we will see a Jewish world in which modern Hebrew is not only the language of the state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael, but also the language of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. Through Sicha, we are hoping to engage a wider audience in appreciating the value of investing in Hebrew and in joining us in disrupting the status quo. For tonight's program, Hebrew in America Today is a paradigm shift possible, the first in the series. We are privileged to welcome Rabbi Elie Kaunfer and the esteemed Ruth Wisse in conversation. Rabbi Kaunfer is the president and CEO of the Hadar Institute, our co-host for tonight, an organization committed to Jewish learning and community building. He is a Wexner Graduate Fellow and Duro Fellow and author. Elie holds a doctorate in liturgy from the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he was also ordained, as well as smicha from his longtime teacher, Rav Daniel Landis. Professor Ruth Wisse recently retired from her position as Martin Peretz Professor of Yiddish Literature and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard, is currently the Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Tikvah Fund. She is a renowned speaker, educator, and prolific writer. I now want to introduce Rabbi Andrew Ergis, the new CEO of Hebrew at the Center, who will moderate this series. For more than 20 years, Rabbi Ergis has held leadership roles across the spectrum of Jewish education, from camp to day school to JCCs and more. He has demonstrated his own personal passion for Hebrew, not only through his professional life and graduate work in Hebrew language and literature, but also in the past 3 years as chair of the board of the Council for Hebrew Language and Culture in North America. Andrew?
Arnie, thank you so much. And Elie and Ruth, thank you for joining us as we launch this Sicha, this conversation between ourselves and with the broader community about the role of Hebrew in our lives, in our community, and in America. I think it'd be really wonderful to start by just hearing your own personal journeys when it comes to Hebrew and why it's played an important role in your own lives. Elie, Ruth, please.
No, please, Elie, go first. I'd love to hear your journey.
Okay, well, happy Mother's Day to everybody, and to Ruth and Arnie and everybody else on the call. It's exciting to be here and to reflect with you on this question, which is dear to my heart. I'll say from my own Hebrew journey, I was just reminding myself of the story that I just told my kids, which is when I was about their age, when I was like in the 2nd grade or something, I would run into in the halls of our synagogue, I would run into one of the Hebrew teachers, which was the same place of the Schechter school that I went to as a kid. And she would always speak to me only in Hebrew. And she would say Ma Shalomcha, and I always got confused and thought she was saying Ma Shimcha, which of course nobody ever says in Hebrew. And I would always answer Elie. And I was like, why doesn't she know my name by now? And I think it was sort of like a classic, American kid growing up in Providence, Rhode Island, and their relationship to Hebrew, struggling through it. I think I had a typical Hebrew education, which was very focused on grammar charts and workbooks, and sacred literature, but not really spoken Hebrew in any meaningful way. I think for me, that really shifted when I spent time living in Israel after college as a Dorot Fellow. And one of the rules of the fellowship was you had to live with an Israeli, because they wanted you to really get immersed in the language. And that really helped turn a corner for me in Hebrew speaking. And since then, I've lived in Israel about 4 different times for year-long periods. And being in Israel really did jumpstart my own Hebrew journey. And I would say that 2 of those times were with my kids. And part of the whole idea was to bring them there to make them more native Israeli Hebrew speakers than I was. And I think the last thing I'll say about my Hebrew journey, I really turned a corner when I realized that as long as you're faking an Israeli accent, Israelis think that you're speaking Hebrew very well. And so I think part of it even just means, for me, stepping into a persona and just sort of jumping right in, as opposed to, the grammar charts of my youth.
Rabbi Kaunfer, thank you for your story. Ruth.
I have to tell you that my training is certainly not in high tech, because I cannot see any of you. You can see me, I can hear you, so we will just continue. But just to say that I'm functioning blind here. My journey is very different. I was very well educated in elementary school, in a marvelous school, which was actually affiliated with the labor Zionist movement in Montreal. But we studied mostly in Yiddish. And although Hebrew was definitely on the curriculum, it was basically Chumash stories. We never studied Dikduk. I never learned Hebrew formally. Then when I was 16 years old, a friend who was actually in a Hebrew school said to me, you know, you should go to Camp Masad, which was a Hebrew-speaking camp, and all the kids who went to this Hebrew-speaking camp really came from the Hebrew day school system. I said, I can't go. I really don't speak Hebrew. And he said, sure, you'll just pick it up. So I went to the camp, and it was fantastic. The first word I learned was Yitushim, for mosquito, of course. And then one of the other first words I learned was Tzimriya. I thought this was fantastic. Tzemer, Tzimriya. And then when we went to Israel for the first time, about, 4 or 5 years later, I was staying with my hosts, and one evening I said to them, Ha'im ani tzricha lahavi tzimriya. They looked at me as if I was crazy, and I couldn't make myself understood. I'd worked so hard. So I went into the room and showed them, and they said, Sveter. You know, this is a pick-me-up game for me, but I've never stopped trying to learn Hebrew. And a year and a half ago, I decided the time had come. So I've been taking Hebrew lessons, conversational Hebrew. Now I feel a little bit more confident speaking. I've been reading a lot all my life. As a scholar, of course, I've had to read Hebrew, but it's still a language that I love more than I possess.
So I'm first of all, thank you for taking us down the beginning of this conversation and for sharing a bit of your own personal journey. I'm sort of interested, if I take an element out of each of what you shared. In one case, there really was an aspect of taking on Hebrew for a utilitarian purpose, being able to function within an Israeli setting. And then there's that element of the kind of study that one does, sort of the coming at it from a more academic or scholarship perspective. And I'm wondering if beyond sort of serving the needs of the elite or those who seek out Hebrew for very utilitarian purposes, what might be the importance of Hebrew for everyone else, for that broader audience who's not an elite and who's not making aliyah or on their way to spend extensive periods of time in Israel?
Well, take a stab at it, but that's really the question, because I think for both Elie and myself, this is so deeply professionally involved and personally involved that there was just no other way but to struggle to possess Hebrew at the highest level that each of us could reach. But, the study of Jewish language is really one of the most extraordinary journeys of all. The Jews have a relation to language, which is like that of no other people. And it's been a question of need. Hebrew has been kind of the spine, the national spine. And that has been because of the way in which the Bible is read, in which the Bible is studied, and in which it forms really the basis of everything that has to do with living as a Jew. So Hebrew has always been there. Anyone who is a Jew has had to know Hebrew. This is the first time, or it was one of the first times when really a Jew can function, I suppose, in a synagogue where things are handled in English enough so that they don't have to know Hebrew. But Hebrew was always there, and yet that was not usually the vernacular. So Jews really wrote it in their other Jewish languages and the languages that they developed wherever they were. Ladino, there's Judeo-Arabic, there's Judeo-Persian. There are dozens of Jewish languages of which Yiddish is merely the most developed. What I mean to say by this is that it's all a question of need, Andrew. That's the word that you used. It's all a question of whether a people needs the language. And Jews have always used the language that they need. So the question for us in America really is how many Jews really feel that they need Hebrew? When State of Israel was created and was even in its formative years, it's not just Eliezer ben Yehuda and David Ben Gurion who understood that the national language would have to be Hebrew as it is spoken. It's the people themselves who realized that when people are coming from Yemen and from Poland and from Salonika, there's going to have to be one national language. It was the most extraordinary thing in the history of linguistics. No people has ever reclaimed a high status language to be used as a vernacular. The Jews of Israel needed it, so they brought Hebrew alive as a daily language. The question in America is really who needs it? And for those people who need it, that's the question that I would ask Elie, because he obviously is surrounded by people who are learning Hebrew in order to need it for some purpose or other. But that's the question that we have to ask ourselves.
Yeah.
Are the Jews of America Jewish enough to need it in any way?
I think that's a great question. I think going back to Andrew's framing of, is this only for the elite? I feel like once you define this as an elite project, we're totally sunk. Because in some ways, elite languages are meant to die. Think about Latin. I went to a high school in Providence, Rhode Island. It was called Classical. And it was called Classical because they taught Latin and Greek. By the time I got there, they weren't teaching Greek anymore, and Latin was not required. It was optional, and the people who were taking Latin were the elite of that school. But someone had a vision at some point that everybody would learn the classical languages. And I think in some ways the American scene is one in which Hebrew might be defined for the elite or left to the elite, even though that's not how Hebrew ever saw itself. We are the people of the book, and the book was written in Hebrew, as the song that you played at the opening of this webinar said. The Bible was written in Hebrew. Let there be light was said in Hebrew. So there is some vision that Hebrew is the language that everybody accesses, even if it's not their vernacular. It's Lashon HaKodesh. It's reserved for certain moments or for certain particular contexts, perhaps, although now it's obviously used all the time, at least in the land of Israel. But in my view, it can't be elite because then we never actually get to live that dream and that incredible, transformation that you were speaking about, Professor Wisse, about, this is the greatest linguistic, story of the, certainly of the last hundreds of years, if not ever. So I feel very strongly that we have to imagine a world in which it's not elite, even if the need which drives language acquisition isn't as clear and present as it might have been in other Jewish contexts.
Well, the only hope, it's been years that we have been talking about what to do. Those of us who really are very much invested in the project of trying to get people to speak Hebrew more. The question is really, what is going to do it? Well, the Hebrew-speaking camp that I spoke of was founded then by Hebraists. These were gentlemen who decided that what we needed was a camp where people would speak Hebrew all the time, and therefore they would learn Hebrew in this particular way. And it worked then, because those were the years when Zionism was so pervasive among, I would say, the Jewish Jews, especially in Montreal, that you could do that we would walk around in the evenings, even I was just learning the language, and I was so proud to be going with a boy who insisted on speaking Hebrew, even when you were walking down a road together.
He was an American?
Yeah, no, these were Canadians.
Oh, Canadian, he was a Canadian, yeah.
Canadians. And it was just, it was in the 50s. This was, and you can understand that there was a kind of a pride in the camp of really maintaining this, playing baseball in Hebrew, going swimming in Hebrew, and not just saying, throw me the kadur, but really knowing the language. But what replaces that? I think what's happened is that many aspects of Jewish life in America have thinned out. And so that pride isn't there in the same way anymore. However, my feeling is that if I were looking for a really hopeful sign, and I think I have found one recently, and that is in the Israelis. Because for Israelis, Hebrew is the language. It's, as you said, Elie, it's not the elites of Israel who speak Hebrew. Hebrew is just the language. So when they come to America for a year or two, or to settle, or for as long as they are, the question is whether they will speak Hebrew with their children, whether the siblings will speak Hebrew with one another, whether the friends will play baseball in Hebrew in the street. If the 500,000 Israelis in the United States and some in Canada, if they spoke Hebrew, and not just the teachers who teach it in the schools, but if they really insisted on it being their language just naturally, that would begin to form a basis of Hebrew speech in our midst. And I think it would become a little bit more natural for other people who tend that way to join them. Let me ask, what happens in Hadar? Is there any movement towards this linguistically?
Yes, I'll speak to that. I don't want to come back to the question of the Israelis who are living in America. I would say, so at Hadar, we've seen two things. Number one, people come to Hadar who want to engage in texts of the Jewish tradition in the original, which were by and large written in Hebrew and Aramaic, although the other languages that you mentioned today, Arabic, Yiddish obviously is also part of it. But at Hadar, we're mainly teaching the original texts that are Hebrew Aramaic. And people have a need. That's their need. That's driving their desire to learn Hebrew. And there's a baseline where if you're going to come and study with us full time, you need to sort of achieve that baseline in order to not be completely discombobulated when you're encountering these texts in the original. So the language of the books that we're looking at is Hebrew. And people want to unlock the wisdom on their own terms. In other words, it's great to have it not filtered through someone else. You get to filter it if you understand the language. Another piece of what happens at Hadar, which is really interesting, is about the modern state of Israel and how that plays into the interactions in the learning environment in two ways. One is that Israelis come to New York and learn at Hadar. We also have a separate Israel division that's doing stuff with Israelis in Israel. But Israelis fly to New York and, in a non-coronavirus environment, are sitting in New York and speaking Hebrew to each other as they're learning these texts. And therefore, if you want access to those conversations, you as an American actually want to at least understand the Hebrew that they're speaking. And we allow that Hebrew to be spoken in the classroom such that the teachers all respond in both languages, and therefore it's sort of an accepted norm that you could speak in Hebrew or in English, and that way it just sort of normalizes the possibility that Hebrew could be spoken in America, certainly by Israelis. The last piece I'll say about Hadar is that since coronavirus, we've opened up our Israel division to our American audience and vice versa, and we have Americans who are dying to learn in Hebrew with Israeli sort of, fluency levels connecting to our classes that are being broadcast out of Jerusalem. And so I think there is this undercurrent, not a lot, probably right now it's still the elite, but an undercurrent of Americans who are looking to really engage in a learning experience that's conducted in Hebrew and not just the texts are in Hebrew. That gives me some glimmer of hope. I just wanted to say about the Israelis that are, that are here. When you think about the need, first of all, I love being on the subway in New York. I remember when we used to go on the subway, being on the subway in New York and overhearing Israelis speak and just either responding to them as if they're completely shocked that anyone could overhear them and understand what they're saying, just for that, shock value. But also there's a need sometimes when Israelis in sort of the business world and the opportunities that are presented by dealing with Israelis in Israel, whether it's high tech or other industries, where it's like you want to learn Hebrew because it is the code language that they're speaking, and you just want to gain access to that same way that you'd want to learn another foreign language because of some, business purpose that you might put it to. Now, Americans are horrible at learning second languages. If we're living in New York, I'm embarrassed at the level of Spanish that I know. it would certainly be a language that would come in useful quantities all the time. But I would say that driving a need that's sort of based in the Israelis who are here, what is the access that we want to them and their conversations that would sort of spur a different orientation and not have Hebrew just locked up in an immigrant community, which hopefully will continue to speak Hebrew, although like many immigrant communities, that may also get lost over time. So I'm asking the same question you are, which is how can we leverage the presence of those 500,000 Israelis in a way in which it drives a natural desire to learn Hebrew in a way that we didn't have before in America?
Well,
I want to, first of all, I love the direction the conversation is taking. I also want to encourage all of our viewers, at the bottom of your screen, there's a button for Q&A. Please feel free to post your questions as our conversation moves along. We'll certainly have some time to share your questions with our two panelists. But I do want to ask a question. Ruth, you had mentioned earlier that Mossad really came out of an entire Hebraist movement that was here in North America. It was really quite a rich movement, generating books and newspapers being printed in North America in Hebrew. And then it kind of moved to Israel. And Israel has really become the focal point of Hebrew. So I'm curious what the two of you think. Has Hebrew stopped being a project of the Jewish people, and does Hebrew now belong to Israelis?
well, that's I would I would fight that question. The minute you begin to think of it that way, Hebrew is done for. Yiddish was the international language of the Jewish people. In 1939, there were about 10.5 million Jews who spoke Yiddish. And for years after that, it remained the lingua franca, as you described Hebrew, Elie, of Jews around the world, because they lived as Jews. And if they lived as Jews, they needed a Jewish language. And they didn't think of it as yours or mine. They thought of it as ours. That was the Jewish language. Hebrew is the international Jewish language. And I think that if you really think of yourself as a Jew, the way exactly as Elie described, you're on the subway and you want to make sure that when you hear someone speaking Hebrew, that you know well enough just to wink at them or to make them know that you also know the language. And when you go to Israel, to feel as much at home as you would linguistically, to be able to pick up the paper there. Just to feel at home in the language is part of feeling at home as a Jew. There's a couple of ways in which this could go. One is, it occurred to me once, you see, the German Jews at some point thought that they were going to become more democratic in their services, and this carried over into America. So since there were so few Jews that began to really know Hebrew well enough in the prayers, more and more of the service of the Reform movement was done in German. And then this happened in America in English. Now, look at how strange that is. They'd thought of it as a kind of democratizing movement, so that everybody should feel more comfortable because everybody would know German or everybody would know English. But the result of it was just the opposite. In a Reform congregation, only the rabbi and the cantor know Hebrew. That is the elite. They're in command of the language. And so in this curious way, by trying to democratize, by dumbing everything down, and by just going into the language of the land and not preserving a Jewish language, what you actually do is you democratize the Jewish people. And instead of giving everyone possession of everything that they need, the main tools of access to the texts and access to Israel and access to its music and access to its culture and its joking, what you do is you artificially create an elite where only the people who really bother to study it then know it. So I think that one has to think of this in reverse, that in order to create a Jewish democratic people in America, a people, you know, that feels itself at home Jewishly, you really have no choice but to sort of suggest that everyone is going to have to possess this language.
I just want to jump into that on the question of some of those reform innovations as it relates to liturgy. At least it's an irony of history, and one that was done about 1,000 years before the period we're talking about. But in 19th century Germany, when you're translating the Hebrew into the vernacular of German, that assumes that the audience that you're translating it for and that's going to take hold of it speaks German. Of course, nowadays, most Jews do not speak German, and there are many more Jews who speak Hebrew. So all of the innovations and the translations and the commentaries that were written in German, which were meant to be more accessible, were lost as a result of, Hebrew actually staying the course, and German is something that fell away as the Jewish people, moved around for obvious reasons. I would just want to say that in the history of liturgy, the first Siddur in Jewish history is Seder of Amram Gaon, who published the Siddur in the 9th century, in the mid-9th century, wrote his commentary on the Siddur and the text of the Siddur in Hebrew and a little bit of Aramaic sprinkled in there. This became a super popular Siddur and lasted in many, many different communities throughout the Jewish world. Saja Gaon, who was no less of a scholar, who published his own Siddur a few years later, wrote his commentary in Judeo-Arabic. And as a result, Judeo-Arabic not being the language of the Jewish people forever and ever, his Siddur was much more limited in its influence. And in some ways, I think, ironically, although Hebrew is meant to be translated into the language that people can understand, whether it's Judeo-Arabic or Ladino or German, ultimately the Jewish people has preserved Hebrew. So I think that I wouldn't want to cede Hebrew to Israelis entirely, because I think the framing is all wrong, even though sort of facts on the ground, they definitely have the upper hand on spoken Hebrew. But I think Ruth's conception of, this is the language of the Jewish people, whether you speak it as your first language or you just absorb it some other way, we can't give up on that and cede it to a particular nation state that exists right now in its entirety.
Well, but, it is also a nation state unlike any other. I mean, the privilege that Israel extends to us is so uncommon. We tend to generalize about nations and cultures and people, and we dare not do that, because I think we're constituted very differently. The law of return is the most, again, like the Hebrew language, it is totally unique. And one has to understand how unique it is. It is the first universal immigration law. And in that sense, it's much more daring and in some sense dangerous than anyone understands. It is a universal immigration law because Judaism is constituted in such a way that not everybody has to be a Jew. Jews are perfectly comfortable with there being 70 nations, or I don't know, 1,070 nations in the world. There can be as many nations as you want, as long as Jews are Jews. But on the other hand, anyone who really wants to can become a Jew. So if you have an immigration law that says that the law of return to Israel is extended to every Jew, everybody who really wants to be a Jew, this is a potentially universal law. But my point here is that when you can't say Israelis, everybody is a potential Israeli. I mean, yes, they're Israelis because that's a citizenship as well. We're American Jews, but everybody understands that if you want to become a dual citizen, and if you want citizenship of Israel, it is your right as a Jew to claim it. Now that, that's a privilege that is, we haven't created enough prayers of Thanksgiving, because there are things that one has to be grateful for and express gratitude for that you dare not take for granted. And that is surely one of them. So I don't accept this distinction between, as it were, Israelis and what belongs to them in the Hebrew and so forth. Yes, it is theirs now, but is potentially that of our children, of our grandchildren. It's there for the having.
I certainly think we're very like-minded in some of these aspects in the relationship between Jews and Israel and Israelis. We also know that on a fairly regular basis, there are significant conversations about a growing gap between the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community. And I'm wondering what you think that tension, what its role is on advancing a Hebrew agenda.
Well, I'm ready to answer, but I would defer to Elie. I can't see his facial reaction. I don't know if he's eager to answer it.
I mean, look, I think that there might be a tendency to blame supposed separation, a peoplehood split in America and Israel that is also sort of standing behind this need for Americans to connect to Hebrew. On the other hand, I think that the reality is, as we know from a lot of the polling data, most American Jews have very little connection to Israel one way or the other, which I think this attenuated relationship to Judaism and to Israel are sort of linked. And Professor Wisse mentioned this before. I think that the opportunities that we have to link people from a Kishka standpoint, if I speak if I run into you, in a third country, and you're speaking English, and I understand English, and nobody else around me understands English, I have a connection to you in a way that I don't otherwise. And I think in some ways, I'm wondering if the causal arrow could go the other way, which is to say, if there's a desire, if there's some relationship that Americans have to the Hebrew language, such that Israel, which is the living lab of that language right now, is a place where, just from a linguistic standpoint, it's like a hugely interesting place to be. I wonder if that might help thicken some of these ties that are attenuated, for one reason or another. And I'll tell you the experiment we did with our kids as sort of the inverse of this, which is we took our kids to live in Israel twice for a year. And for them, Israel isn't a theoretical. Israelis are not constructs. They're not political inventions. They are real live people that they have real live relationships with, and that they are like WhatsApping with, because we're all stuck at home. There is, and part of what's driving that is their ability to communicate with these friends of theirs in Hebrew as natural speakers. And that is something that, who knows where their views and politics will go as they grow up, but the connection they have to being able to speak Hebrew fluently, I think, will drive some deeper peoplehood connection that you might not have. So I'm just wondering, and sort of, is a paradigm shift possible? What I'm suggesting is there a way in which we think of this as Hebrew actually as the sort of top goal, and that will drive some sort of connections and feelings that might not flow the other way? Now, it's hard to move to Israel with your family for a year. I understand that's like a high bar. Although Elie Leibowitz recently suggested that people should send their kids to college in Israel. Right. You get a better deal and you get the language of people and all that. That might be something that, given their rates of coronavirus versus us in New York, I'm not sure is such a bad idea, even from the global health standpoint. But I think if they'll have us, I wonder actually how the law of return is going to interact with the virus situation. But I think the possibility of having language first drive the connection. I'm wondering if that might have any legs at some point.
But it can't work. It's a lovely idea and it can work for your children, but in your case, you see, I would say it was not that the language that was driving it. It was the parents who took the children to Israel that was driving it. Mm-hmm. It was the probably your parents that were driving it to begin with. I think that we dare not leave this conversation without looking at what's usually called the elephant in the room. And in this case, it's worse than an elephant. The question of Hebrew is, it can't be treated differently or apart from the popularity of Israel and the Jews. And the war against Israel, which is, may I say, the most lopsided war in human history, and by now one of the longest. We pretend it isn't there. We say that there's a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but there's actually an Arab war against the Jews, against the Jewish right to a homeland that's never stopped since 1945, before the state and so forth. Now, this has been brought into America in a very, very real and vicious way. It's eaten its way into the universities, consumed the universities. It's now eating its way into the polity, consuming one of the parties of the United States. And its goal is to make Hebrew, the Jews, and Israel extremely unpopular. And the most painful thing that one has seen on campuses is how that works. It works like a charm. The first thing you see is Jewish students losing their moral self-confidence, plummeting in Hillel houses, plummeting, and then they join anti-Israel organizations and so forth and feel very proud of that and so forth. Now, the status of Hebrew is the first thing that was affected. We used to have, when I came to Harvard in 1993, there were over 100 students studying Hebrew at all the levels, all the time. By the time I left, it had been decimated, and Arabic had risen in its place. And that was not an accident. That just didn't happen. This is driven. And I'm afraid that because we are such accommodators as a people, that's our role. We don't want to occupy others. We don't want to imperially conquer others. We're not like those who are driving the war against us. We don't even answer in kind. So the role of Hebrew, in a sense, becomes even more important, because I think that if you can affirm Hebrew within that negative context, it really becomes an act of tremendous self-affirmation. But you see, it requires a great deal more on the part of people. It was really much easier 25 years ago than it is today. And so I think that one has to take that into account. I don't know, I'm not saying that one has to, by taking it into account, I think one has to do it subtly in some ways. It's not something that you want to blare. But if we're not honest with ourselves about what is diminishing Israel, or so-called what is driving a wedge between Israel, I love that phrase, but look, there's no wedge between Italian Americans and Italy. I mean, they can live in America for generations. And is there a wedge between them? Of course not, because no one is anti-Italian. The wedge is not being driven because there's some magical thing pulling the Jewish people apart. The wedge is being driven by the war against the Jews, which American Jews are reluctant to confront, and certainly reluctant to fight back.
So Ruth, I want to ask actually surface a question that one of our viewers presented, and you talk both about needing to be subtle, but also needing to be bold. Nigel Savage actually asked if maybe we could do part of this conversation in Hebrew, and I think he was both interested in seeing where that might go, but I think he was also identifying that for many people, it would be hard for them to participate in this conversation if we did this all in Hebrew. And I'm sort of wondering if even on another level, in terms of sort of the distancing, has the additional sort of acculturation into America, and I know you come from a Canadian community, the sort of this aversion to bilingualism. What do we make of the fact that even when in large gatherings between Israelis and committed Jews, when they come together, the language that they speak together is English? What do we do about that?
That's, I mean, that's a very good point. I think that if you feel that way, do it. I mean, I think then I would just do it. I would, if I'm in that kind of a gathering and I didn't think it was impolite, that's always the question. You don't want to use it as a weapon to exclude people. And, you know, when it's a gathering that everyone is nice to each other at, and you want to be welcoming, and you know that everybody would understand English, you don't want to make anyone feel excluded. But I would start doing that. Yeah, start speaking Hebrew under those circumstances. If at least half the people there speak Hebrew, and if it's as natural for both sides, by all means, speak Hebrew, and then just keep speaking it. If people answer you in English, if that's what you're trying to do, you just do it. That's how chinks get, you know, put into the armor.
אני הייתי לפני כמה שנים בכנס של שמעון פרס, וזה כנס בינלאומי, כאילו יהודים בכל רחבי העולם, אז כולם באים לירושלים, באיזה שפה אנחנו מדברים? רק באנגלית.
ודאי.
כאילו, מה זה אומר שאנחנו בארץ, כאילו זה כנס לכבוד הנשיא של ארץ ישראל, וכולם מדברים באנגלית. I think in some ways it shows that we don't want to exclude people, but also it's the standards lowering that is so difficult. I should also say that I was like, oh great, I'm going to a conference in Israel, I will not bring a tie. And everyone was wearing a tie. Well, like, what's happening here? We're not speaking Hebrew and everyone's wearing a tie. So I think there is this pull of Israelis who also want to be, it's your sweater. What makes that story funny is that it's like, here you are struggling to learn Hebrew and they just want to learn English, and all the words that you'd invented, they're chucking out for English substitutes. And I think in some ways there's a reverse pull. We all know this, that when you speak in Hebrew, they speak to you in English. And in some ways, they just want to practice their English. So I think there is a standard that we could set where you would just conduct certain things in Hebrew, and people who can't figure it out are, you know, brought along. We were wondering in a sort of pre-conversation how much the impact of Israeli television that now actually is good as an export to American audiences. Well, if you're watching that and all you're getting is the subtitles, are you losing something in the translation that would you know, increase your desire to learn the Hebrew, or to at least watch it with Hebrew subtitles? Would that help your, you know, your language acquisition in some ways? And you want to know it. There's a need now because you actually just want to experience the pop cultureness of it in its full technicolor. You know, these are things that might drive it, but I think it's an embarrassment that we allow people to get away with ignoring Hebrew as a possible lingua franca of the Jews, given the fact that the Jews, you know, the majority of Jews, you know, speak Hebrew now.
Well, maybe your story about Peres is very funny, because of course I was one of those conferences as well, but you forget that he was the great internationalist. The point of those conferences was to be in English. In other words, they weren't Jewish conferences, even if that was sometimes their subject. It was really to show the technological universality and tech savviness of Israel and so forth. But that's the question now. I think that really one of the points that I would make is that militancy doesn't always work in languages, because I began by saying that people speak the languages that they need. And you're saying, well, maybe the popularity of Hebrew culture is now going to make you need or want to participate in Hebrew a little bit more. That's a possibility. But I would say that I would try out this, that the more disliked Israel becomes, the more the war against Israel is being brought into our midst, is really being driven into the heart of America. I think this is the time when Jews might really consider becoming a little bit more militant. And it might be easier to do it through insisting on Hebrew than to do it in where I think it really has to be done, and that is in the political arena. So it might be something to show, the phrase that I would always use is moral confidence. When Jews lose their moral confidence, it's a very bad sign for the world. And maybe one sign of moral confidence can be Hebrew, the insistence on it, that we didn't have to do it that way before, when it was either popular or not. You know, when Exodus was the most popular book in America, with Paul Newman playing the role of Ari Ben Canaan, you didn't have to insist on Hebrew because it was popular. But today, when one is being driven against the wall, really, you know, I would wonder whether this cannot become a fighting word. Hebrew.
Yeah, you're making me think, actually, because I was a student at Harvard as an undergrad in the years that you were talking about, you know, 25 years ago. It's actually our 25th reunion just got canceled this year. And I took Hebrew. I took 2 semesters of Hebrew there. And I remember there was nothing political at all by signing that study card. You know, it was just like, great, it's a language, the language department, nobody is batting an eye. Now that was a particular moment in history also with the Oslo Accords, and everybody who was upset for moments earlier had sort of taken a break from that for a period. I remember that we merged at Harvard Hillel, they actually merged the right-wing and left-wing Israel student group into one group, because it was like, why should we have right-wing and left-wing anymore? We're in times of peace, it's all over. So it was like sort of it was a very unique moment in the history of studying the language. But you're just making me think that, you know, if studying Hebrew or speaking Hebrew becomes politicized, just like everything else about Israel is politicized, and you're suggesting that actually standing up and speaking Hebrew is an act of moral confidence, it's like a whole other ball game about what it means to have a renaissance of Hebrew in America, much in the way that I suppose some people might look upon me speaking Spanish. You know, it's like, why should you, you know, it's like, let's nationalize English as the language of America. So you could have that approach, and just sort of the politics that stand behind this question you're raising for me as like much more fraught than they used to be. Maybe that could turn to the advantage of speaking Hebrew, but it's certainly a different situation than it was 25 years ago. I appreciate your raising that aspect to it.
We've actually had a couple of interesting questions, which I'd like to. I also want to be attentive to the time. I'll sort of share a couple of the clusters. There's certainly a few different people asked, can we remove Hebrew, not just from the conversation about Israel, but about Jewish culture in general? Is Hebrew like any other second language, or does it have a unique, distinct role in connection to our language? And then Leah Meir asked the question, are the translations of so many books, whether traditional Jewish texts or modern Israeli authors, is that undermining our Hebrew agenda? So I'm sort of interested in, you know, you're both people who care deeply about culture. You're both authors. You both certainly understand the power of text, both in the original as well as being accessible to a larger audience. What do we do about this, about these questions?
You're making me think, Andrew, about the amazing development of Sefaria, which has really democratized through essentially by purchasing the Steinsaltz translation of the Talmud and the English translation. Steinsaltz translated into vernacular Hebrew, and then they translated that Hebrew into English, and now everybody, through a click of a button without paying a cent, can access that. And so anybody can read the Talmud, and it actually sounds like it makes sense in English, which is definitely not the experience of reading the Talmud up until 10 years ago. And I think that on the one hand, I'm wondering, if that's the same comparison that Professor Wisse was suggesting is happening in Germany in the 19th century. It's like, if you translate the Talmud into the vernacular, do you let go of something very special and specific about what it meant in its original language? And at the same time, it's available to so many more people than it used to be. And so is Hebrew just a barrier in its sort of standing in the way of understanding and comprehension of ideas and concepts? Or is it itself the vessel of the concept? And I feel like, as somebody who cares about the study and practice of liturgy, I feel like every translation is always going to kill you in liturgy, because it's never going to really capture the multi-vocal associations that are packed into each word. And in that way, we really do lose something if we were to translate everything and make everything accessible and open to everybody. And it may, in fact, diminish our desire or our need to learn the language, even as it gives us the impression that we understand things now. And I think I love Safari, and our world is much, much richer for it. And I also wonder how many people who used to be motivated to learn the Talmud in the original are now like, you know what, I'm just going to read it in the English. That's going to work for me. And is that cutting against our ability to learn Hebrew as well?
Well, I think that the minute you try to block anything, you've lost the war in that sense. That you can't block English, and there's no point in raising it if people want to move in that direction. As I understand it, Jews were always told that they had to read the Bible in the original. And in fact, Jews are so jealous of the way in which the Bible is read that the precision of reading it is in itself a kind of a religious duty. It's raised to that level. On the other hand, what again defines us as a people is that there was always an insistence that this be translated into the language of the land. So we would be defying our tradition if we said, hey, just let's try to protect us from going in that direction. No, I don't think that's the point at all. But I would say that the positive drive is something that one has to insist upon. And again, you see, it's so strange that you use this. You use the word political as if one can avoid this. I think a retreat to the synagogue is a political move. So, I think that when people begin to feel very comfortable in the synagogue and they just don't want to go out there and face the problem of what's confronting Israel, that's a decision that American Jews make, which is, I think, extremely cowardly and immoral, because the people in Israel don't have that choice. At the age of, 17, they have to go into the army, whether they want to or not. That is to say, some can choose individually not to, but the country, everybody has to go to train for war. In America, we think we don't have to train for war. We don't have to train for political battle, when the whole thrust of the world's animus is really being, driven against us in our own turf, in our own country. So I don't think we have that choice. So I would say that, if to make Hebrew into a positive value for whatever reasons, yes, of course, for learning, for the ancient reasons, and for the modern reasons, and for the movies, and for everything else, but also because it's more of a duty nowadays. It's more of a, you have to toughen up, and you have to toughen up in a concrete way. And I would think that this is one of the most pleasant ways, one of the most positive ways in which we can be affirmative. So I would say it's a question not of translating. I would just say it is a question of really affirming the need for Hebrew much more strongly.
With so many questions, we'll be saving these and sending them on to you. Maybe if you each have a final thought, like what gives you hope that's going to allow us to move the paradigm around Hebrew in America forward?
Well, you guys, I mean, look what you've organized. You know, what Elie does, what we all do. What gives me hope, I have great hope in the Jewish people. Everything that depends on the Jews, I have hope for. Everything that depends on others, I have despair for. That's how I see it at this moment in time.
Yeah, and I guess my hope lies with the eternality of the Jewish people and the eternal nature of the Hebrew language that was on the ropes, seemed to be on the ropes, just like the Jewish people so many times in our history. And, you know, my prayer is that in America, it will, you know, sort of roar forward for whatever the motivation. But I do believe that Hebrew is eternal and will last wherever the Jews are.
Hear, hear.
Well, I want to really thank you both for engaging with one another with some of these questions which had really no answers, but surfaced some of the inherent tensions that are at play in making something not only dynamic, but meaningful for so many. And I'd like to turn it back to the president of Hebrew at the Center, Barney Winchell.
Thank you, Rav Todot. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Elie. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, all of the people who joined us today. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions and some of the really interesting dialogue going on between the people who are listening in. I do want to wish everybody who is a mother a happy Mother's Day, and all of those with mothers a happy Mother's Day. And I want to encourage you to join us for our future sichot that are coming up. Next week, we have a sicha called A Tribal Language for a Global People with Jeremy Benstein and Avraham Infeld at 1 o'clock Eastern Time. And in the future, after that, we will have two others, Hebrew Culture and Identity with Nancy Berg and Melissa Weininger, and Reimagining the Future of Hebrew in North America following that. And we just hope you will continue to engage with us in this conversation. You will find outlets for learning Hebrew and support our teachers, who are the people who give us this gift and bring this gift to us. Special shout out to Alicia Post from AZM, the American Zionist Movement, who helped to do all the back technical work for us, support us in making this program a success. And to the team at Hebrew at the Center at Ivrit Merkaz, who every day live with this mission and really want to see it happen in the world. Oh, everybody have a lovely evening, afternoon, depending where you are. For us, Erev Tov. Toda.